Bradley Lewis, 22, was born to Steve Lewis and Rachel Hawkins in Bristol, England. Those who knew him described him as kind, caring, and well-liked. He grew up in a close-knit family, adored his siblings, and had a natural ability to connect with people. Friends said that if Bradley became your friend, it was for life. Bradley was passionate about soccer and played for Hanham Athletic for several seasons. He wasn't just a talented athlete, he was the heart of the team, always uplifting his teammates and making new connections with ease. However, for him, family always came first. Bradley was a father of 4. His eldest daughter, Scarlett, was from a previous relationship with a woman named Leigh. His 3 other children were from his relationship with 24-year-old Abigail White, whom he had been with for over 5 years. Abigail never held a steady job but made a living through the platform Onlyfans, where she posted explicit content under the alias Fake Barbie. In her first year, she earned around £55,000, approximately $70,000. However, as competition grew, her income rapidly declined, eventually dropping to about £1,000, $1,300 per month. According to Abigail, Bradley was aware of her work and had no objections. However, after her first pregnancy, she completely stopped posting and lost her source of income. From that point on, Bradley became the sole provider for their family. He worked in flooring installation and often took extra jobs to support them. Despite his efforts, Bradley and Abigail's relationship was strained. Many who knew them described their dynamic as toxic, unstable, and at times violent. Opinions on their conflicts varied. Some claimed Abigail had a tendency toward aggressive behavior, while others suggested Bradley also displayed hostility. Their arguments frequently escalated into loud, public fights, and witnesses often saw their disputes firsthand. Abigail had a short temper and was prone to jealous outbursts. She claimed Bradley was controlling and emotionally distant, but those around them described her as someone who easily lost control. Regardless of their struggles, Bradley remained in the relationship for the sake of their children. However, their life together was far from stable, as the same conflicts repeated over and over again. Over time, the situation worsened. Bradley's loved ones began to notice changes in his behavior. He grew distant and anxious. He attempted to leave Abigail multiple times, but each time she convinced him to stay. Friends said Bradley felt trapped and didn't know how to leave without hurting his children. Their relationship had always been rocky, but as time passed, it became more volatile and destructive. Both had been unfaithful to each other, yet despite her own infidelity, Abigail constantly suspected Bradley of cheating. She monitored his whereabouts, followed him when he left home, and tried to catch him with other women. Abigail demanded his full attention. She expected immediate responses to her messages, and if he didn't reply quickly enough or at all, she would fly into a rage. As their fights escalated, Abigail's behavior became increasingly controlling and violent. As the cycle of arguments and betrayals continued, she grew more obsessive, manipulative, and aggressive. In private messages to friends, she called Bradley a liar and said she needed to force the truth out of him. In one message, she admitted she wanted to kill him but couldn't afford to go to prison. In another, she said she wanted to get rid of the woman she suspected he was cheating with but again, couldn't risk her freedom. In voice messages, she confessed that she struggled to control her anger and never believed a word Bradley said. She also admitted that people warned her their relationship would end in tragedy. Abigail even stated that Bradley only confessed to things when she threatened him, sometimes by pulling out a knife. Over time, Abigail's threats turned into real violence. In a fit of rage, suspecting Bradley of cheating, she once threatened to stab him in the face. Instead, she slashed his leg, leaving a deep scar that would stay with him for life. This incident occurred just months before the tragedy. Then on March 19, just 1 week before the fatal night, history repeated itself. Accusing Bradley of infidelity yet again, Abigail attacked him with a knife, this time injuring his arm badly enough that he required medical attention. Bradley confided in friends that he was afraid of Abigail. He repeatedly said he wanted to leave the relationship, but every time he tried, she threatened to take her own life. Under the weight of her threats, Bradley stayed, trapped in a never-ending cycle. Messages later recovered confirmed that Bradley had made multiple attempts to break free, but Abigail always manipulated him, using threats against herself to make him stay. Their relationship became a revolving door of fights, breakups, and reconciliations. Despite the toxicity, they kept coming back to each other. Since they had 3 children together, Family Protective Services began monitoring their situation. After multiple violent incidents, authorities ruled that Bradley and Abigail could no longer live under the same roof. However, they ignored this order, secretly continuing to reside together in their home in Kingswood, hiding it from officials. By early 2022, Bradley finally reached his breaking point. He packed his things and moved in with his mother, determined to sever ties with Abigail for good. Social services required that their contact remain minimal, but they continued texting and calling each other. Eventually, Bradley agreed to meet Abigail to talk things over. On March 25, 2022, he met with Abigail and a mutual friend at a park. There, he told her he no longer wanted to be with her and for the first time admitted to his infidelities. Though Abigail had long suspected him of cheating, hearing him confirm it was a devastating blow. Still, she didn't take his words seriously. Bradley had tried to leave before, only to return each time, and Abigail was convinced this would be no different. After their talk, Abigail suggested they continue the conversation at a pub. By 5:30 p.m., surveillance cameras captured her arriving at the Horseshoe Pub in Kingswood with friends and her children. Bradley, however, was late, and his delay began to irritate Abigail. She kept drinking while waiting for him, growing angrier by the minute. Witnesses later recalled that she downed a pint of beer, several shots, and possibly a couple of strong cocktails. One friend attempted to reassure her, saying Bradley would arrive soon, but in the restroom, Abigail broke down, sobbing to a friend that he was probably with another woman. Bradley finally arrived at the pub at 6:48 p.m. Abigail was already furious. Witnesses said she immediately started arguing with him. She wanted to talk in private, but Bradley refused, choosing instead to stay with their friends. He kept turning away from Abigail, engaging in conversations with others, which only fueled her rage. She began hurling insults at him, threw her drink in his face, and even struck him multiple times in front of everyone. When one of Bradley's friends tried to intervene, Abigail spat in his face. The situation was escalating fast. Abigail didn't hold back, even in the presence of children and friends. At one point, Bradley stepped away to the restroom with a friend, where he admitted that he was afraid of Abigail and wanted to end the relationship. However, he also feared that she might harm herself. When they returned, the situation had somewhat calmed down, and Abigail suggested they leave the pub. But Bradley still had a few unfinished drinks on the table and wanted to finish them before heading out. This enraged Abigail again. She knocked the drinks off the table, declaring that now he had nothing left to finish. As she continued causing a scene, a woman around 30 years old approached their table and asked what was going on. Abigail snapped at her with a rude remark, which prompted the woman's male companion to step in and reprimand Abigail for her behavior. In response, Abigail threw a drink in his face and struck him. The man, unable to hold back, retaliated and knocked Abigail to the ground. At that point, Bradley intervened, trying to de-escalate the situation. But the events of that night had already spiraled out of control, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. Bradley attempted to stop the man who had hit Abigail, insisting that no one should treat her that way, but the damage was done. Abigail was furious and turned on Bradley, blaming him for everything, saying it was his fault she had been hit because he didn't protect her. In the heat of the argument, Abigail called 911 to report an assault, omitting the fact that she had instigated the fight and was the first to get physical. Mid-call, she abruptly hung up, and when the dispatcher called back, she gave a false name to support her version of events. Later, security footage from the pub would reveal that Abigail had been the main aggressor, acting hysterically, provoking people, and creating chaos. After another outburst, Bradley decided it was best to leave. Their friend Alfie Pike offered to give them a ride home. As they were getting ready to go, Bradley turned to Alfie and said something unsettling, "I'm a dead man when I get home." Alfie asked him what he meant, but Bradley simply repeated the statement. It seemed that Abigail had overheard this, but she showed no reaction. Bradley's friends tried to convince him not to leave with Abigail, fearing for his safety, but he insisted. Alfie drove Bradley, Abigail, and one of their children back to their old home in Kingswood. They arrived around 7:50 p.m. Before Bradley got out of the car, Alfie handed him his number, telling him to call if he needed help. Just a few minutes later, Bradley did call Alfie, but it's unclear whether Alfie picked up. However, at 7:54 p.m., Bradley made another call to a friend named Sophie. Sophie was a close friend of Abigail's and knew a lot about their relationship. Abigail often texted Sophie about her anger toward Bradley, even mentioning thoughts of hurting him. But over time, Sophie and Bradley had also formed a friendship. That night when Bradley called Sophie, he was in a panic. "Help me, Sophie, she's trying to kill me, she keeps hitting me, she's trying to stab me." As Sophie listened, she could hear Abigail screaming at Bradley in the background, demanding that he shut up while he pleaded for help. By 8:00 p.m., a neighbor named Laura Cundy heard screaming coming from Abigail's house. She distinctly made out a man's voice begging for help and a woman's voice shouting that she couldn't get through to 911. Then the woman screamed, "He can't breathe." Realizing the severity of the situation, Laura immediately called 911 herself and rushed toward the house. When she arrived, she saw Abigail standing outside, still trying to call emergency services. As Laura stepped inside, she saw a young boy standing in the living room doorway, his face frozen in fear and confusion. Laura stepped forward and was met with a horrifying scene. Bradley lay on the kitchen floor, covered in blood with open wounds on his chest. Blood was smeared across the floor and walls, and in some spots there were signs that someone had tried to wipe it away. The washing machine was running, creating the impression that someone was attempting to clean up the evidence. In the hallway, Laura spotted a knife resting on the radiator. Its blade, about 6 to 7 inches long, was stained with blood. Seeing all of this, Laura immediately called 911 again. The scene was gruesome. Bradley lay helpless on the floor, while the house showed clear signs of an attempt to cover up what had happened. Laura rushed to help Bradley. He was pale, unresponsive, but still breathing, though very weakly. In the kitchen, she spotted a t-shirt and, following the dispatcher's instructions, pressed it against Bradley's wound to slow the bleeding. As she worked, Laura turned to Abigail and asked what had happened. At that moment, Abigail was wearing a pink dress. There was a bruise on her arm, but no blood on her hands or clothing. In response, Abigail insisted that Bradley had done this to himself. Laura pressed further, asking if they had been arguing. Abigail admitted there had been a fight, but repeated that Bradley had inflicted the wound on himself. Abigail was in a full-blown panic. She screamed at Laura, "Why is it taking so long? Why isn't anyone coming?" She shook Bradley's face, begging him to hold on. Laura tried to stay focused on counting Bradley's breaths and keeping pressure on the wound, but Abigail's shouting only made it harder. Then, from another room, a child's voice rang out, "Mom did it." Laura froze. That single statement changed everything. While they waited for paramedics, Laura's husband arrived to assist. A few minutes later, emergency responders finally showed up. They immediately began CPR, then loaded Bradley onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital. Abigail lost control. She screamed, tried to interfere with the paramedics, and Laura and her husband had to physically restrain her to keep her from disrupting their efforts. As Bradley was taken to the hospital, officers escorted Abigail there as well. She insisted on staying by his side. On the way, she cycled between sobbing hysterically and firmly declaring her innocence. She kept repeating that she had nothing to do with what happened. Doctors did everything they could to save Bradley. He was rushed into emergency surgery, but despite their best efforts, it was too late. At around 1:00 a.m. on March 26, Bradley succumbed to his injuries. His body was sent for a forensic autopsy. The medical examiner determined that he had suffered a single stab wound to the chest. The knife had pierced between his ribs, reaching his heart. The blade had gone in at least 3 inches, causing fatal damage. The wound had struck his ventricle, leading to rapid blood loss and death. Following the autopsy, Abigail was arrested on suspicion of involvement in the crime and taken to the police station for questioning. However, she refused to give any statements. Later, after consulting with an attorney, she prepared a written statement for the police. In her statement, Abigail claimed that she and Bradley had argued that night. She alleged that during the fight, Bradley grabbed a kitchen knife and she became afraid that he would harm himself. She said she managed to take the knife away and tried to run out of the kitchen to dispose of it. However, according to her version of events, Bradley caught up to her, grabbed her arm, and somehow stabbed himself in the chest. Abigail knew there would be fingerprints and blood on the knife, so she had already come up with an explanation. Her story was that she had only been holding the knife to stop Bradley from hurting himself, but at some point he had stabbed himself. This version of events only emerged after she had spoken to her attorney. Abigail added that immediately after the incident, she tried to call an ambulance but allegedly couldn't get through, so she went outside to find a better signal. It was then that Laura heard her screams that Bradley was not breathing. Initially, Abigail stuck to this version of events, but in July 2022, she changed her testimony in court, pleading guilty to manslaughter. She admitted that she had indeed stabbed Bradley, but claimed she did not intend to kill him. According to the law, manslaughter means that a person did not intend to kill or seriously harm the victim, but their actions still resulted in death. This version of events was Abigail's attempt to present what happened as an accident, claiming she did not want Bradley's death, although her actions led to the tragedy. This new version of the story was another attempt to sway the case in her favor, but it only confirmed the fact that Abigail had delivered the fatal blow. Abigail argued that during the argument she tried to move away from Bradley to the kitchen to calm down. However, once there, she noticed a knife on the counter. According to her, she decided to take the knife to scare Bradley. She grabbed it by the handle with the blade pointing downward, just like the times before when she had already hurt Bradley. Once in the past, she had stabbed him in the leg and once in the arm. Abigail insisted that she never meant to hurt him and only wanted to frighten him. But when she approached Bradley, she suddenly stabbed him in the chest. She claimed that she only realized what she had done after it was too late. She stated that everything happened too quickly and she did not have time to think through her actions. After the incident, Abigail started cleaning up the scene, wiping blood off the kitchen floor, throwing the bloody clothes into the washing machine, and changing her clothes. During this time, she came up with a version of events that she later told the police. Abigail confessed that she regretted lying at first, but continued to insist that she hadn't realized she had delivered the fatal blow. However, for the prosecution, this wasn't enough. In October 2022, 24-year-old Abigail White was brought to trial, charged with a crime against Bradley Lewis's life. The prosecution argued that their relationship had always been toxic and dangerous. Abigail was described as aggressive, controlling, and manipulative. She demanded constant attention, gifts, and affection from Bradley, but was never satisfied. The worse she treated him, the more he withdrew and eventually started seeking support elsewhere. This only intensified the tension in their relationship. Bradley had repeatedly told his friends that he feared Abigail and wanted to end the relationship. He shared that she had threatened him, been violent, and even attacked him with a knife. However, every time Bradley tried to break up with her, she threatened to take her own life, making him feel trapped. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence, including text and voice messages from Abigail to her friends, where she openly expressed her aggressive intentions. In one message, she directly stated that she planned to kill Bradley, and in another, she said she needed to shake the truth out of him, threatening violence. Investigators discovered numerous threatening messages Abigail had sent to Bradley. For instance, on February 7, she texted him, "I swear to God, I'll stab you." Later that day, she added, "After that, I'll take my own life." There were also threats directed at a woman whom Abigail suspected Bradley was cheating with. On March 21, she threatened Bradley again, writing, "I'll stab you in the neck." In response to Bradley's accusations of cheating, she continued to threaten both him and herself. In one message, she wrote, "I'll end my life right on your mother's doorstep." From March 22 to March 25, their communication continued. During this period, they were living separately under a family protective order. However, Abigail continued to message Bradley. He complained of both physical and emotional pain, not only from the breakup, but also from the injuries she had inflicted on him earlier. Bradley tried to avoid conflicts, asking her to leave him alone and suggesting they end the relationship, but Abigail kept insisting on meeting. They agreed to meet at the park on March 25, but even after that meeting, Abigail continued to send threatening messages. Bradley tried to stop the contact, but she pressured him, threatening both him and herself. In her messages, she would say it's over, but each time she expected Bradley to convince her to stay. When he agreed to break up with her, it only further irritated Abigail, causing new outbursts of rage. Prosecutors argued in court that their messages clearly showed Abigail was the aggressor and the source of the violence. Her threats, fits of rage, and history of abusive behavior demonstrated that the tragedy was not an accident. The prosecution believed that when Bradley finally decided to end the relationship for good, Abigail couldn't accept it and committed the crime. Even though she later expressed remorse, the prosecution emphasized that this did not change the fact that she intentionally stabbed him, leading to Bradley's death. The defense tried to present Abigail in a different light, claiming that she loved Bradley and never meant to harm him. The attorneys argued that their relationship had been toxic on both sides and that Bradley also provoked conflicts. They stated that he had been cheating on her regularly, manipulating her, and making her feel humiliated and unhappy. Additionally, the defense argued that Bradley had been a controlling partner, especially when it came to finances. When Abigail made significant amounts of money on the Onlyfans platform, he allegedly decided how to spend it, not allowing her to manage it herself. Witnesses were called to describe Abigail as a kind and pleasant person. They acknowledged that she had anger issues but attributed them to her mental state, claiming she couldn't control her outbursts of aggression. During the trial, a psychiatrist was brought in to examine Abigail's childhood and psychological condition. He explained that her life had been difficult from the start. She grew up in a family where her father regularly used violence against her mother. When she was 4 years old, her parents divorced, but her life didn't get easier. Her mother remarried, and her stepfather also used abusive behavior towards her. Eventually, she was taken from the family and placed in foster care. Later, she lived with her grandparents who took care of her. By then, childhood traumas had already deeply affected her psyche. In her teenage years, she began experiencing serious behavioral issues. School was a struggle, and her outbursts of anger became more frequent. At 13, she first attempted suicide, and at 16, she tried again. Around the same time, she entered into a relationship with a 29-year-old man, which further worsened her emotional state. Soon after breaking up with him, she began seeing Bradley, who was 15 or 16 at the time. It was also noted that from the age of 13, Abigail regularly consumed alcohol and occasionally used illegal substances, but she claimed she wasn't addicted. In her teenage years, she was diagnosed with depression and prescribed medication. She underwent therapy with psychiatrists several times. When her relationship with Bradley began, she didn't feel supported by him. She claimed that he called her crazy, didn't try to help her deal with her emotional issues, and even used manipulation and aggression. A psychiatrist who was invited to testify in court diagnosed Abigail with borderline personality disorder. He pointed out that her behavior, as observed by witnesses, as well as her own explanations of the events that night, were consistent with symptoms of this disorder. According to him, most people have mechanisms to control their emotions, but Abigail lacked these mechanisms. When she became enraged, the rational part of her brain ceased to function, and she didn't realize what she was doing. The psychiatrist also noted that at the time of the attack on Bradley, she was likely in a state of crisis. In the defense's view, her diagnosis indicated a reduced level of responsibility for what happened. Additionally, it was revealed that a few weeks before the tragedy, Abigail had become pregnant again but decided to have an abortion. She said that she didn't want to have another child in such difficult circumstances. This, along with her suspicions of Bradley's infidelity, led to an increase in stress, which reached its peak on the day of the tragedy. However, the psychiatrist hired by the prosecution disagreed with this explanation. He confirmed that Abigail did indeed have problems controlling her emotions, but her diagnosis didn't justify her actions and couldn't serve as a basis for mitigating responsibility. The psychiatrist hired by the prosecution confirmed that Abigail was indeed diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which makes a person emotionally unstable and prone to acting impulsively based on emotions. However, he emphasized that this did mean she wasn't aware of her actions. According to him, Abigail was not in a state of psychosis or blackout. She knew what she was doing when she left the argument, grabbed a knife, and returned to strike Bradley. The fact that she tried to cover up the crime afterward served as evidence of her awareness. She started wiping away the blood, washed her bloody clothes, and only then called emergency services. After the incident, she was able to give Lori and the police clear and logical answers, which indicated that her rational thinking was intact. An examination showed that Abigail's blood at the time of the tragedy contained alcohol, traces of illegal substances, and antidepressants. However, the psychiatrist noted that this did not affect her ability to comprehend what was happening. She was fully in control of her actions and is responsible for them. When Abigail testified in her defense, she continued to insist that she hadn't intended to kill Bradley. She stated that she lost control due to intense emotions and only realized the consequences afterward. She admitted that she regretted lying to the emergency operator when she claimed that Bradley had harmed himself. Abigail said that she loved Bradley but felt betrayed and deeply hurt by his actions. When reminded of the text messages and voice recordings where she explicitly mentioned wanting to kill Bradley, she replied that she hadn't taken her words seriously. When asked about a voice message in which her friend Sophie heard Abigail shouting at Bradley and hitting him before the tragedy, she said she didn't remember any of it. She also claimed that she didn't remember the moment she struck him with the knife. After hearing all the arguments and reviewing the evidence, the jury went into deliberation. After about 5 hours of discussions, they reached a verdict. Abigail White was found guilty of the crime against Bradley Lewis. During the sentencing hearing, Bradley's family shared their feelings and spoke about the consequences of this tragedy. Bradley's father, Steve Lewis, admitted that since his son's death, he has been living with an overwhelming sense of pain and loss. He recalled how Bradley had a way of making those around him smile, and how he was a kind and caring person, especially toward his family. Bradley's mother, Rachel, said that losing her son had left an irreplaceable void in her life. She was deeply hurt by the thought that Bradley would never see his children grow up, never be there to support them, or to share important moments in their lives. In delivering the sentence, the judge emphasized that Bradley was a loving father with a full life ahead of him. Through her actions, Abigail had not only taken their children's father but also their mother, as she was now going to prison for many years. The judge also noted that one of the most tragic aspects of this case was that their 3-year-old son had witnessed his mother delivering the fatal blow to his father. Under the law, Abigail faced a life sentence for such a crime, but the judge had to determine the minimum sentence based on aggravating and mitigating factors. Among the aggravating factors were the presence of the child during the crime, Abigail's history of abusive behavior toward Bradley, including constant humiliation and threats, and her past experience of violence in this relationship. As for mitigating factors, Abigail's mental health disorder and the emotional strain that had built up over time were considered, but the judge felt these weren't enough to reduce the severity of the sentence. In the end, Abigail White was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 18 years before she could petition for a review of her case. From the beginning, this case was filled with warning signs. Both partners were unhappy with each other and regularly provoked conflicts, but it was Abigail, consumed by rage, who committed the crime. This case serves as yet another example of how dangerous toxic relationships can be and how ignoring warning signs can lead to tragedy. Abigail needed psychological help, and Bradley, despite his fear for her life, should have left the relationship much earlier. In situations like these, it's crucial to understand that if a relationship becomes dangerous to one's life or mental health, it's necessary to find a way to leave, even if the partner threatens self-harm. A person's mental health should not jeopardize another's safety. If someone threatens to take their own life, it's always a signal that professional intervention is needed. But this doesn't mean the partner must remain in a destructive relationship. This case shows the importance of recognizing the signs of a toxic relationship early and not delaying the breakup if the situation becomes dangerous. Unfortunately, Bradley failed to do this, and it ended in tragedy. Abigail now faces many years in prison, where she may finally receive the psychological help she needed throughout her life. However, for Bradley and his entire family, this outcome is an irreplaceable loss, and no punishment can bring him back to his loved ones.